A very long time ago, in midwinter, when the snowflakes were falling like feathers from heaven, a beautiful queen sat sewing at her window, which had a frame of black ebony. As she worked, she looked sometimes at the falling snow, and it happened that she pricked her finger with her needle, so that 3 drops of blood fell upon the snow. How pretty the red blood looked upon the dazzling white! The queen said to herself as she looked at, "Ah me! If only I had a dear little child who had skin as white as the snow, lips as rosy as the blood, and hair as black as the ebony window frame." Soon afterward she had a little daughter, with skin white as snow, lips rosy as blood, and hair as black as ebony, and she was therefore called Little Snow White. But alas! When the little one was born, the good queen died. A year passed by, and the king took another wife. She was a beautiful woman, but proud and haughty, and she could not bear that anyone else should surpass her in beauty. She had a mirror, and when she stood in front of it and asked, "Mirror, mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" the mirror answered, "Thou, O queen, art the fairest of all," and the queen was contented, because she knew the mirror could speak nothing but the truth. But as time passed on, little Snow White grew more and more beautiful. When she was 7 years old, she was as lovely as the bright day, and still more lovely than the queen herself, so that when the lady one day asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" it answered, "O lady queen, though fair ye be, Snow White is fairer far to see." The queen was shocked, and grew yellow and green with envy, and from that moment envy and pride grew in her heart like rank weeds, so that she had no peace day or night, until one day she called a huntsman and said, "Take the child away into the woods and kill her, for I can no longer bear the sight of her. When you return, bring with you her heart, that I may know you have obeyed my will." The huntsman dared not disobey, and he led Snow White out into the woods and placed an arrow in his bow to pierce her innocent heart, but the little girl cried and begged him, saying, "Ah, dear huntsman, leave me my life. I will run away into the wild forest, and never come home again." And as she was so beautiful, the huntsman had pity on her and said, "Run away then, you poor child." While to himself he thought, "The wild beasts will soon have devoured you," and yet it seemed as if a stone had been rolled from his heart, since he no longer had to kill her. Then as a young wild boar came rushing by, he killed it, took out its heart, and carried it home to the queen. The cook was ordered to prepare this, and the wicked queen ate it, and thought she had eaten the heart of Snow White. Poor little Snow White was now all alone in the wild wood, and so frightened was she that she trembled at every leaf that rustled. Then she began to run, and ran over sharp stones and through thorns, and the wild beasts ran past her, but did her no harm. She kept on running until she came to a little house, where she went in to rest. Inside the cottage, everything she saw was tiny, but more dainty and clean than words can tell. Upon a white-covered table stood 7 little plates, and upon each plate lay a little spoon, besides which there were 7 knives and forks and 7 little goblets. Against the wall, and side by side, stood 7 little beds covered with perfectly white sheets. Snow White was so hungry and thirsty that she took a little food from each of the 7 plates, and drank a few drops of wine from each goblet, for she did not wish to take everything away from one. Then, because she was so tired, she crept into one of the beds, but it did not suit her, and so she tried the others, but one was too long, another too short, and so on, until she came to the 7th, which suited her exactly. She said her prayers and soon fell fast asleep. When night fell, the masters of the little house came home. They were 7 dwarfs, who worked with a pickaxe and spade, searching for copper and gold in the heart of the mountains. They lit their 7 candles and then saw that someone had been to visit them. The first said, "Who has been sitting on my chair?" The second said, "Who has been eating from my plate?" The third, "Who has taken a piece of my bread?" The fourth, "Who has taken some of my vegetables?" The fifth, "Who has been using my fork?" The sixth, "Who has been cutting with my knife?" The seventh, "Who has been drinking out of my goblet?" The first looked around and saw that his bed was rumpled, so he said, "Who has been getting into my bed?" Then the others looked round and each one cried, "Someone has been on my bed too." But the seventh, when he looked at his bed, saw little Snow White, who was lying asleep there. He called the others, who came running up, and they cried out with astonishment, and brought their 7 little candles and let the light fall on little Snow White. "Oh, heavens! Oh, heavens!" cried they. "What a lovely child!" They were so glad that they did not wake her up, but let her sleep on in the bed. And the 7th dwarf slept with his companions, 1 hour with each, and so got through the night. When the sun rose, Snow White awoke, and oh! how frightened she was when she saw the 7 little dwarfs. But they were very friendly, and asked what her name was. "My name is Snow White," she answered. "And how did you come to get into our house?" asked the dwarfs. Then she told them how her cruel stepmother had intended her to be killed, but the huntsman had spared her life and she had run on until she reached the little house. The dwarf said, "If you will take care of our house, cook for us, make the beds, wash, mend, and knit, and keep everything neat and clean, then you may stay with us and you shall lack for nothing." "Yes," answered Snow White. "With all my heart," and so she stayed. She kept the house neat and clean for the dwarfs, who went off early in the morning to search for copper and gold in the mountains, and who expected their meal to be standing ready for them when they returned at night. All day long Snow White was alone, and the good little dwarfs warned her to be careful to let no one into the house. "For," said they, "your stepmother will soon discover that you are living here." The queen, believing, of course, that Snow White was dead, and that she had eaten her heart, and therefore she was again the most beautiful lady in the land, went to her mirror, and said, "Mirror, mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest fair of all?" Then the mirror answered, "O Lady Queen, though fair ye be, Snow White is fairer far to see. Over the hills and far away, she dwells with 7 dwarfs today." How angry she was, for she knew that the mirror spoke the truth, and that the huntsman must have deceived her. She thought and thought how she might kill Snow White, for she knew she would have neither rest nor peace until she really was the most beautiful in the land. At length she decided what to do. She painted her face and dressed herself like an old peddler woman, so that no one could recognize her, and in this disguise she climbed the 7 mountains that lay between her and the dwarf's house, and knocked at their door and cried, "Pretty things to sell, very cheap, very cheap." Snow White peeped from the window and said, "Good day, good wife, and what are your wares?" "All sorts of pretty things, my dear," answered the woman. "Silk and laces of every color," and she held up a brightly colored one, made of plaited silks. "Surely I might let this honest old woman come in?" Snow White thought, and unbolted the door and bought the pretty lace. "Dear, dear, what a sight for sore eyes you are, child," said the old woman. "Come, let me lace you properly for once." Snow White had no suspicious thoughts, so she placed herself in front of the old woman that she might fasten her dress with the new silk lace. Immediately the wicked creature laced her bodice so tightly that she could not breathe, and fell down upon the ground as though she were dead. "Now," said the queen, "I am once more the most beautiful lady in the land," and she went away. When the dwarfs came home they were very grieved to find their dear little Snow White lying upon the ground as though she were dead. They lifted her gently and, seeing that she was too tightly laced, cut the silken cord. She drew a long breath and then gradually came back to life. When the dwarfs heard all that had happened they said, "The peddler woman was certainly the wicked queen. Now, take care in future that you open the door to none when we are not with you." The wicked queen had no sooner reached home than she went to her mirror, and said, "Mirror, mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest fair of all?" And the mirror answered as before, "O Lady Queen, though fair ye be, Snow White is fairer far to see. Over the hills and far away, she dwells with 7 dwarfs today." The blood rushed to her face as she heard these words, for she knew that Snow White must have come to life again. "But I will manage to put an end to her yet," she said, and then by using witchcraft, she made a poisonous comb. Again she disguised herself, climbed the 7 mountains, and knocked at the door of the 7 dwarfs' cottage, crying, "Pretty things to sell, very cheap today." Snow White looked out of the window and said, "Go away, good woman, for I dare not let you in." "Surely you can look at my goods," answered the woman, and held up the poisonous comb, which pleased Snow White so well that she opened the door and bought it. "Come, let me comb your hair in the newest way," said the woman, and the poor unsuspicious child let her have her way, but no sooner did the comb touch her hair than the poison began to work, and she fell fainting to the ground. "There, you model of beauty," said the wicked woman, as she went away. "You are done for at last." Fortunately it was almost time for the dwarfs to come home, and as soon as they came in and found Snow White lying upon the ground they guessed that her wicked stepmother had been there again, and set to work to find out what was wrong. They soon saw the poisonous comb, and drew it out of her hair, and almost immediately Snow White began to recover, and told them what had happened. Once more they warned her to be on her guard, and to open the door to no one. When the queen reached home, she went straight to the mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest fair of all?" The mirror answered, "O Lady Queen, though fair ye be, Snow White is fairer far to see. Over the hills and far away, she dwells with 7 dwarfs today." When the queen heard these words she shook with rage. "Snow White shall die," she cried, "even if it costs me my own life." She went into a secret chamber, where no one else ever entered, and there she made a poisonous apple. She then painted her face and disguised herself as a peasant woman, and climbed the 7 mountains and went to the dwarf's house. She knocked at the door. Snow White put her head out of the window, and said, "I must not let anyone in, the 7 dwarfs have forbidden me to do so." "It's all the same to me," answered the peasant woman, "I shall soon get rid of these fine apples. But before I go I'll make you a present of one." "Oh! No," said Snow White, "for I must not take it." "Surely you are not afraid of poison?" said the woman. "See, I will cut one in 2, the rosy cheek you shall take, and the white cheek I will eat myself." Now, the apple had been so cleverly made that only the rose-cheeked side contained the poison. Snow White longed for the delicious-looking fruit, and when she saw that the woman ate half of it, she thought there could be no danger, and stretched out her hand and took the other part. But no sooner had she tasted it than she fell down dead. The wicked queen laughed aloud with joy as she gazed at her. "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony," she said. "This time the dwarfs cannot awaken you." She went straight home and asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest fair of all?" At length it answered, "Thou, O Queen, art fairest of all." So her envious heart had peace, at least, as much as an envious heart can have peace. When the little dwarfs came home at night they found Snow White lying upon the ground. No breath came from her parted lips, for she was dead. They lifted her tenderly and sought for some poisonous object which might have caused the mischief, unlaced her frock, combed her hair, and washed her with wine and water, but all in vain. Dead she was and dead she remained. They laid her upon a bier, and all 7 of them sat round about it, and wept as though their hearts would break, for 3 whole days. When the time came that she should be laid in the ground they could not bear to part from her. Her pretty cheeks were still rosy red, and she looked just as though she were still living. "We cannot hide her away in the dark earth," said the dwarfs, and so they made a transparent coffin of shining glass, laid her in it, and wrote her name upon it in letters of gold, and that she was a king's daughter. Then they put the coffin out upon the mountain top, and one of them always stayed by it and watched it. And birds came too and wept for Snow White, first an owl, then a raven, and at last a dove. For a long, long time little Snow White lay in the coffin, but she did not change. She only looked as though she slept, for she was still as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as ebony. It chanced that a king's son came into the wood, and went to the dwarf's house, meaning to spend the night there. He saw the coffin upon the mountain top, with little Snow White lying within it, and he read the words that were written upon it in letters of gold. He said to the dwarfs, "If you will but let me have the coffin, "You may ask of me what you will, and I will give it to you." But the dwarfs answered, "We would not sell it for all the gold in the world." Then said the prince, "Let me have it as a gift, I pray you, for I cannot live without seeing little Snow White, and I will prize your gift as the dearest of my possessions." The good little dwarfs pitied him when they heard these words, and so gave him the coffin. The king's son then bade his servants place it upon their shoulders and carry it away, but as they went they stumbled over the stump of a tree, and the violent shaking shook the piece of poisonous apple which had lodged in Snow White's throat out again, so that she opened her eyes, raised the lid of the coffin, and sat up, alive once more. "Where am I?" she cried, and the happy prince answered, "Thou art with me, dearest." Then he told her all that had happened, and how he loved her better than the whole world, and begged her to go with him to his father's palace and be his wife. Snow White agreed and went with him, and the wedding was celebrated with great splendor and magnificence. Little Snow White's wicked stepmother was invited to the feast, and when she had dressed herself in her most beautiful clothes, she stood before her mirror, and said, "Mirror, mirror upon the wall, who is the fairest fair of all?" And the mirror answered, "O Lady Queen, though fair ye be, the young queen is fairer to see." Oh! How angry the wicked woman was then, and so terrified too, that she scarcely knew what to do. At first she thought she would not go to the wedding at all, but then she felt that she could not rest until she had seen the young queen. No sooner did she enter the palace than she recognized little Snow White, and could not move for terror. Then a pair of red-hot iron shoes was brought into the room with tongs and set before her, and these she was forced to put on and to dance in them until she could dance no longer, but fell down dead, and that was the end of the wicked queen. Once there was a gentleman who married, for his second wife, the proudest and most haughty woman that was ever seen. She had been married before, and already had 2 daughters who were exactly like her in all things. He had likewise, by his first wife, a young daughter, but of unequaled goodness and sweetness of temper, which she took from her mother, who was the best creature in the world. This sweet little girl missed her mother, who had died. No sooner was the wedding ceremony over, than the new wife began to show herself in her true colors. She could not bear the goodness of the gentleman's pretty girl, and especially as she made her own daughters appear the more horrid. She made her do the meanest jobs in the house. The girl scoured the dishes and tables, and scrubbed the stepmother's bathroom, and those of her daughters. She slept in a little attic, upon a wretched straw bed, while her sisters lay upon beds with the softest pillows, in fine rooms, with floors covered with beautiful carpets, and walls on which hung looking-glasses so large that they might see themselves at their full length from head to foot. The poor girl bore all patiently, and dared not tell her father, who would have been angry with her, for his new wife ruled him entirely. When the little girl had done her work, she used to go into the chimney corner, and sit down among cinders and ashes, which led her to be called Cinderwench, but the youngest stepdaughter, who was not quite so rude and unkind as the eldest, called her Cinderella. However, Cinderella, dressed in rags, was 100 times prettier than her sisters, though they were always dressed very richly. It happened that the king's son gave a ball, and invited all the finest gentlemen and ladies of the city. Our young misses were also invited, for they were always to be seen at fashionable parties. They were truly delighted at this invitation, and wonderfully busy in choosing such gowns, petticoats, and headdresses as might suit them. This was a new trouble to Cinderella, for it was she who washed and ironed her sisters' clothes and got all their things ready. Meanwhile, the sisters talked all day long of nothing but what they should wear to the ball. "For my part," said the eldest, "I will wear my red velvet suit with French trimming." "And I," said the youngest, "shall have my usual petticoat, but then, to make amends for that, I will put on my gold-flowered gown, and my diamond belt, which is far from being the most ordinary one in the world." But in truth, they were still not absolutely sure what would be best to wear to the ball, so they sent for the best fashion designer they could find to advise on their evening dresses, and they had their nails manicured at Mademoiselle de la Poche. Cinderella was likewise called up to them for advice, for she had excellent judgment, and advised them always for the best, indeed, and offered her services to make up their hair, which they were very willing she should do. As she was doing this, they said to her, "Cinderella, would you not be glad to go to the ball?" "Alas," said she, "you only jeer me. It is not for a poor girl like me to go there." "You're quite right," replied they, "it would make the people laugh to see a cinderwench at a ball." Anyone but Cinderella would have dressed their heads all wrong, but she was very good, and dressed them perfectly well. The stepsisters were almost 2 days without eating, so much were they thrilled and excited. They broke above a dozen corsets in trying to be laced up tightly, so that they might have a fine slender shape, and they were continually at their looking-glass. At last the happy day came. They went to court, and Cinderella followed them with her eyes as long as she could, and when she had lost sight of them, she fell a-crying. Just then, her fairy godmother, who used to watch over her secretly, saw her all in tears, and appeared at her side and asked her what was the matter. "I wish I could, I wish I could." She was not able to speak the rest, being interrupted by her tears and sobbing. This fairy godmother of hers said to her, "You wish you could go to the ball, is it not so?" "Why, yes," cried Cinderella, with a great sigh. "Well," said her godmother, "be but a good girl, and I will see that you shall go to the ball." Then she took her into her secret room, and said to her, "Run into the garden, and bring me a pumpkin." Cinderella went immediately to gather the finest she could get, and brought it to her godmother, not being able to imagine how this pumpkin could make her go to the ball. Her godmother scooped out all the inside of the big vegetable, leaving nothing but the rind, which done, she struck it with her wand, and the pumpkin was instantly turned into a fine coach, gilded all over with gold. She then went to look into her mousetrap, where she found 6 mice, all alive, and ordered Cinderella to lift up a little the trapdoor. As each mouse went out, she gave it a little tap with her wand, and the mouse was that moment turned into a fine horse, which altogether made a very fine set of 6 horses of a beautiful mouse-colored dapple-gray. But they still needed a coachman. "I will go and see," said Cinderella, "if there is a rat in the rat-trap, we may make a coachman of him." "You're a smart one," replied her godmother, "go and look." Cinderella brought the trap to her, and in it there were 3 huge rats. The fairy made choice of one of the 3 which had the largest beard, and having touched him with her wand, was turned into a fat, jolly coachman, who had the smartest whiskers eyes ever beheld. After that, she said to her, "Go again into the garden, and you will find 6 lizards behind the watering can, bring them to me." She had no sooner done so but her godmother turned them into 6 footmen, who skipped up immediately behind the coach, with their uniforms all bedaubed with gold and silver, and clung as close behind each other as if they had done nothing else their whole lives. The fairy then said to Cinderella, "Well, you have here transport fit to take you to the ball. Are you not pleased with it?" "Oh yes," cried she, "but must I go there as I am, in these nasty rags?" Her godmother only just touched her with her wand, and at the same instant, her clothes were turned into cloth of gold and silver, all beset with jewels. This done, she gave her a pair of glass slippers, the prettiest in the whole world. Being thus decked out, she got up into her coach, but her godmother, above all things, commanded her not to stay until after midnight, telling her at the same time that if she stayed 1 moment longer, the coach would be a pumpkin again, her horses mice, her coachman a rat, her footmen lizards, and her clothes become just as they were before. She promised her godmother she would not fail to leave the ball before midnight, and then away she went, scarce able to contain herself for joy. The king's son, who was told that a great princess, whom nobody knew, was to come, ran out to receive her. He gave her his hand as she alighted out of the coach, and led her into the ball, among all the company. There was immediately a profound silence, they left off dancing, and the violin ceased to play, so attentive was everyone to contemplate the singular beauty of the unknown newcomer. Nothing was then heard but a confused noise of, "Ah! How lovely she is! Ah! How lovely she is! The king himself, old as he was, could not help watching her, and telling the queen softly that it was a long time since he had seen so beautiful and lovely a creature. All the ladies were busied in considering her clothes and headdress, that they might have some made the next day after the same pattern, provided they could meet with such fine material and as able hands to make them. The king's son led her to the most honorable seat, and afterward took her out to dance with him. She danced so very gracefully that they all more and more admired her. A fine banquet was served up, of which the young prince ate not a morsel, so intently was he busied in gazing on her. She went and sat down by her sisters, showing them 1,000 polite gestures, giving them part of the oranges and lemon blossoms which the prince had presented her with, which very much surprised them, for they did not recognize her. While Cinderella was thus amusing her sisters, she heard the clock strike 11 3/4, whereupon she immediately made a curtsy to the company and hasted away as fast as she could. When she got home she ran to seek out her godmother, and after having thanked her, she said she could not but heartily wish she might go next day to the ball, because the king's son had desired her. As she was eagerly telling her godmother whatever had passed at the ball, her two sisters knocked at the door, which Cinderella ran and opened. "How long you have stayed!" cried she, gaping, rubbing her eyes and stretching herself as if she had been just woken out of her sleep. She had not, however, any manner of inclination to sleep since they went from home. "If you had been at the ball," said one of her sisters, "you would not have been tired. There came there the finest princess, the most beautiful ever was seen with mortal eyes. She was 1,000 times nice to us, and gave us orange and lemon blossoms." Cinderella seemed very indifferent in the matter. Indeed, she asked them the name of that princess, but they told her they did not know it, and that the king's son was very uneasy on her account and would give all the world to know who she was. At this Cinderella, smiling, replied, "She must then be very beautiful indeed. How happy you have been! Could not I see her? Ah! Dear Miss Charlotte, do lend me your yellow suit of clothes which you wear every day." "Ay, to be sure," cried Miss Charlotte. "Lend my clothes to such a dirty cinderwench as you. I should be a fool." Cinderella indeed expected well such answer, and was very glad of the refusal, for she would have been sadly put to it if her sister had lent her what she asked for jokingly. The next day the two sisters were at the ball, and so was Cinderella, but dressed more magnificently than before. The king's son was always by her, and never ceased his compliments and kind speeches to her, to whom all this was so far from being tiresome that she quite forgot what her godmother had recommended to her, so that she, at last, counted the clock striking 12 when she took it to be no more than 11. She then rose up and fled, as nimble as a deer. The prince followed, but could not overtake her. She left behind one of her glass slippers, which the prince took up most carefully. She got home but quite out of breath, and in her nasty old clothes, having nothing left of all her finery but one of the little slippers, fellow to that she dropped. The guards at the palace gate were asked if they had not seen a princess go out. They replied that they had seen nobody go out but a young girl, very meanly dressed, and who had more the air of a poor country wench than a gentlewoman. When the two sisters returned from the ball, Cinderella asked them if they had been well diverted, and if the fine lady had been there. They told her yes, but that she hurried away immediately when it struck 12, and with so much haste that she dropped one of her little glass slippers, the prettiest in the world, which the king's son had taken up, that he had done nothing but look at her all the time at the ball, and that most certainly he was very much in love with the beautiful person who owned the glass slipper. What they said was very true, for a few days after the king's son commanded it to be proclaimed, by sound of trumpet, that he would marry the young woman whose foot would perfectly fit the slipper. He sent out his most trusted advisers from the palace, who began to try it upon the princesses, then the duchesses and all the court, but in vain. It was then brought to the two sisters, who each did all that she possibly could to thrust her foot into the slipper, but neither sister could manage to do so. Cinderella, who saw all this, and knew her slipper, said to them, laughing, "Let me see if it will not fit me." Her sisters burst out laughing, and began to tease her. The gentleman who was sent to try the slipper looked earnestly at Cinderella, and finding her very handsome, said it was only right that she should try, and that he had orders to let every girl try. He asked Cinderella to sit down, and putting the slipper to her foot, found it went on very easily, and fitted her as if it had been made of wax. The astonishment her two sisters were in was excessively great, but still abundantly greater when Cinderella pulled out of her pocket the other slipper, and put it on her foot. Thereupon, in came her godmother, who having touched with her wand Cinderella's clothes, made them richer and more magnificent than any of those she had before. Now her two sisters found her to be that fine, beautiful lady whom they had seen at the ball. They threw themselves at her feet to beg pardon for all the ill treatment they had dished out to her. Cinderella took them up, and as she embraced them, cried that she forgave them with all her heart, and desired them always to love her. She was brought by carriage to the young prince, dressed as she was. He thought her more charming than ever, and a few days after, married her. Cinderella, who was no less good than beautiful, gave her two sisters rooms in the palace, and that very same day matched them with two great lords of the court. A long time ago, in a far-away land, a merchant was returning home after a long journey. As night fell, he entered a deep forest. His head was full of thoughts of his 6 daughters. He had left home in summer, and now he was returning in deep winter. The most bitter sleet and snow came down, and his horse stumbled on a patch of ice. He heard wolves howling, and soon he realized that he was lost. At last, he saw some sort of track. At the beginning it was rough and slippery, but soon it led him into an avenue of orange trees covered with flowers and fruit, but here there was no snow. He saw a flight of stone steps. He went up them into a great castle. Inside he passed through several splendid rooms. Everywhere in the castle there was a deep silence. At last, he stopped in a small room where a fire was burning. He lay down on a couch and very soon fell into a sweet sleep. He woke up feeling hungry. He was still alone, but a good dinner had been laid on a little table. He began to eat, hoping that he might soon have a chance to thank his kind host, whoever it might be, but no one appeared. Then he went down into the garden, and though it was winter everywhere else, here the sun shone, and the birds sang, and the flowers bloomed, and the air was soft and sweet. The path had a hedge of roses on each side of it, and the merchant thought he had never seen or smelled such beautiful flowers. Then he remembered a promise he had made to his youngest daughter, who was so lovely that everyone knew her as Beauty. Before setting out on his journey, he had asked his daughters what presents they would like him to bring back for them. The 5 eldest wished for jewels and fine clothes, but Beauty asked only for a single rose. Now, as he stopped to pick a rose to take home to Beauty, he was startled by a strange noise behind him. Turning around, he saw a frightful ugly beast, which seemed to be very angry and sad, and said in a terrible voice, "Who said that you could pick my roses? Was it not enough that I let you stay in my palace and was kind to you? This is the way you thank me, by stealing my flowers. You shall not go unpunished." The merchant was terrified by these furious words. He dropped the fatal rose, and throwing himself on his knees, cried, "Pardon me, noble sir, I am truly grateful to you for your kindness. I could not imagine that you would mind so much if I took such a little thing as a rose." The beast was still furious, however, and cried, "Excuses and flattery will not save you from the death you deserve." "Alas!" thought the merchant. "My daughter's rose has put me in this terrible danger." He began to tell the beast of his journey, not forgetting to mention how Beauty had asked him for a rose. "I beg you to forgive me, for I meant no harm," he pleaded. The beast thought for a moment, and then he said, in a less terrible voice, "I will forgive you on one condition, that is if you will give me one of your daughters." "Ah!" cried the merchant. "What excuse could I invent to bring her here?" "No excuse," answered the beast. "She must come willingly. Go home. I give you a month to see if one of your daughters will save you. If none of them is willing to come to me, you must come back alone. Do not think that you can hide from me, for if you do not keep your word I will come and fetch you." The poor merchant, more dead than alive, went to the stable where his horse was ready for his journey. It carried him off so swiftly that in an instant he had lost sight of the palace, and he was still wrapped in gloomy thoughts when it stopped before the door of his house. His daughters rushed to meet him. At first he told them nothing of the beast, but as he gave Beauty her the rose he said sadly, "Here is what you asked me to bring you, you little know what it has cost." Later that evening he told his family of his adventures from beginning to end, and then his daughters wept loudly. The girls were very angry with Beauty, and said to her that it was all her fault, and complained bitterly that they should have to suffer for her foolish wish. Poor Beauty said to them, "Who could have guessed that asking for a rose in the middle of summer would cause so much misery? But as I made this mistake, it is only right that I should be the one to suffer for it. I will go back to the beast with father." When the fatal day came she said goodbye to her sisters and everything she loved. She mounted a horse together with her father, and it seemed to fly rather than gallop. They soon reached the avenue of orange trees, where statues were holding flaming torches, and when they got nearer to the palace, music sounded softly from the courtyard. Her father led her to the little room where he had stayed, and there they found a splendid fire burning, and a delicious supper set out on the table. After they had finished their meal they heard the beast's footsteps approaching, and Beauty clung to her father. When the ugly beast appeared she tried hard to hide her terror, and she nodded to him politely. This clearly pleased the beast. After looking at her he said, in a voice that might have struck fear into the boldest of hearts, "Good evening, old man." "Good evening, Beauty." The merchant was too terrified to reply, but Beauty answered sweetly, "Good evening, beast." "Have you come willingly?" asked the beast. Beauty answered bravely that she had come willingly to save her father. "I am pleased with you," said the beast. "As for you, old man," he added, turning to the merchant, "at sunrise tomorrow you will go." Then turning to Beauty, he said, "Take your father into the next room and help him to choose presents for your sisters. Take everything they would wish for." Then he left them saying, "Goodbye Beauty. Goodbye old man." In the next room they found splendid dresses fit for a queen. When Beauty opened the cupboard she was quite dazzled by the gorgeous jewels that lay in heaps upon every shelf. After choosing a vast quantity, she opened the last chest, which was full of gold. "I think, father," she said, "that gold will be more useful to you. We had better take out the other things again, and fill the trunks with gold." So they did this, and at last the trunks were so heavy that an elephant could not have carried them. "The beast was making fun of us," cried the merchant. "He pretended to give us these things, knowing that I could not carry them away." "Let us wait and see," answered Beauty. At sunrise, they went down into the courtyard, where 2 horses were waiting, one loaded with the 2 trunks, the other for the merchant to ride. As soon as he climbed into the saddle, he went off at such a pace that Beauty lost sight of him in an instant. Then she began to cry and she went back to her room and fell into a deep sleep. She dreamed that she was walking by a stream when a young prince came up to her and said, in a voice that went straight to her heart, "Ah, Beauty. You are not so unlucky as you suppose. Only try to find me, no matter how I may be disguised, as I love you dearly. Make me happy and you shall be happy. Be as true-hearted as you are beautiful, and we shall have nothing left to wish for." "What can I do, Prince, to make you happy?" said Beauty. "Do not trust your eyes," he answered, "and set me free from my misery." When Beauty awoke, she began to think about the charming prince she had seen in her dream. "He said I could make him happy," said Beauty to herself. "It seems that this horrible beast keeps him a prisoner. how can I set him free? I don't understand it. After all, it was only a dream, so why should I worry about it? She got up to explore the castle, but she did not see anyone or hear any sound, and she began to find it rather dull. Only that evening, after supper, she heard the beast coming, and she trembled with fear at what it might do. But he only said, "Good evening, Beauty." She answered cheerfully and managed to hide her terror. He spoke politely to her for about an hour, and asked her all about her life with her family. Then he said in a gruff voice, "Do you love me, Beauty? Will you marry me?" "Oh! What shall I say?" cried Beauty, for she was afraid to make the beast angry by refusing. "Say yes or no without fear," he replied. "Oh! No, Beast," said Beauty, hastily. "Since you will not, good night, Beauty," he said. And she answered, "Good night, Beast," very glad to find that he had not attacked her. After he was gone, she was very soon in bed asleep, and dreaming of her unknown prince. He came to her and said to her, "Ah, Beauty! Why are you so unkind to me? I fear I will be unhappy for many a long day still." The next morning, she decided to amuse herself in the garden, for the sun shone, and all the fountains were playing. When she was tired she went back to the palace, and found a new room full of rare birds, so tame that they flew to Beauty as soon as they saw her, and perched upon her shoulders and her head. Some of them were parrots and cockatoos that could talk, and they greeted Beauty by name. "Pretty little creatures," she said. "Oh, how I wish that your cage was nearer to my room, that I could often hear you sing." When she left, she opened a door and found that it led straight into her own room. After supper, the beast paid her his usual visit, and before he left he asked her as before, "Beauty, will you marry me?" And when she refused, he gave her a gruff, "Good night," and left her. The days passed, and every evening the beast asked her the same question and she gave him the same answer. Beauty felt that when she said, "No, Beast," he went away quite sad. But her happy dreams of the handsome young prince soon made her forget the poor beast. Her prince always told to let her heart guide her, and not her eyes, and many other equally baffling things which she could not understand. At last, happy as she was, Beauty began to long for her family. One night, seeing her look very sad, the beast asked her what was the matter. Beauty was no longer afraid of him. Now she knew that he was really gentle in spite of his ferocious looks and his dreadful voice. She answered that she was longing to see her home once more. When he heard this, the beast cried miserably, "Ah! Beauty, have you the heart to leave an unhappy beast like me? Is it because you hate me that you want to escape?" "No, dear beast," answered Beauty softly. "I do not hate you, and I should be very sorry never to see you anymore, but I long to see my father again. Only let me go for 2 months, and I promise to come back to you and stay for the rest of my life." The beast replied with a sigh, "I cannot refuse you anything you ask, even though it should cost me my life. You may go. But remember your promise and come back when the 2 months are over, or you may be sorry, for if you do not come in good time you will find your faithful beast dead." Then she went to bed, but could hardly sleep for joy. When at last she did begin to dream of her beloved prince she saw him stretched upon a grassy bank, sad and weary, and hardly like himself. "What is the matter?" she cried. He looked at her reproachfully, and said, "How can you ask me, cruel one?" "Ah! Don't be so sad," cried Beauty. "I am only going to let my father know that I am safe and happy. I have promised my beast that I shall come back. I would not cause him pain by breaking my word. He told me he would die if did not keep my promise to him. What do you care for an ugly beast?" asked the prince. "Oh," said Beauty, "it is not his fault that he is so ugly. He is a very kind beast." Just then, she heard someone speaking not very far away. She got up and then she suddenly heard her father's voice. She rushed out and greeted him. She was home. Her sisters were quite astonished to see her, and there was no end to their questions about her life with the beast. Then Beauty asked her father what he thought could be the meaning of her strange dreams. After much thought, he answered, "You tell me yourself that the beast, frightful as he is, loves you dearly and is kind and gentle to you. I think the prince means that you should do as the beast wishes in spite of his ugliness." But Beauty's thoughts were full of her handsome dream prince, and she could not imagine marrying the beast. When the 2 months were over, Beauty's sisters begged her not to return to the ugly beast, but to stay with her family. At first she could not refuse them, and she stayed on for a few days more. Then one night she had a different dream from usual. She saw not her prince, but the beast. He was lying in a cave and he looked ill and in pain. Then Beauty remembered his words that he might die if she did not stay true to her word. The next day, Beauty said goodbye to her father and all her sisters, and as soon as she was in bed she turned her ring around upon her finger, and said firmly, "I wish to go back to see my beast again." She fell asleep instantly, and only woke up to hear the clock saying, "Beauty, Beauty," 12 times in its musical voice, which told her at once that she was in the palace once more. Everything was just as before, and her birds were so glad to see her. Beauty thought she had never known such a long day, for she was so anxious to see the beast again, that she felt as if supper time would never come. When it did come and no beast appeared, she was really frightened. She ran down into the garden to search for him. Up and down the paths and avenues ran poor Beauty, calling him in vain, for no one answered. At last, quite tired, she stopped for a minute's rest, and saw that she was standing opposite a cave, and in it lay the beast, asleep. Quite glad to have found him, she ran up and stroked his head, but to her horror, he did not move or open his eyes. "Oh! He is dead, and it is all my fault," said Beauty, crying bitterly. But then, looking at him again, she fancied he still breathed. She fetched some water from the nearest fountain and sprinkled it over his face. Slowly, he began to open his eyes. "Ah, Beauty," he said faintly, "now you see what happens when you do not keep your word." "Oh! Beast," she cried. "I never knew how much I loved you until now, when I feared I was too late to save your life." "Can you really love such an ugly creature as I am?" asked the beast. "You only came just in time. I was dying because I thought you had forgotten your promise. Go back now and rest, I shall see you by and by." Beauty went back to the palace, where supper was awaiting her, and afterward the beast came in as usual, and asked about the time she had spent with her family, and if they had all been very glad to see her. When at last the time came for him to go, and he asked, as he had so often asked before, "Beauty, will you marry me?" She answered softly, "Yes, dear beast." As she spoke, a blaze of light sprang up before the windows of the palace, fireworks crackled and guns banged, and across the avenue of orange trees, in letters all made of fireflies, was written, "Long live the prince and his bride." Beauty meant to ask the beast what it all meant, but he had gone. In his place stood her long-loved prince. At the same moment, 2 ladies entered the room. Both were splendidly dressed, but one especially so. Her companion said, "Well, Queen, this is Beauty, who has had the courage to rescue your son from the terrible magic spell that turned him into a beast. They love one another, and your consent to their marriage is all they need to make them perfectly happy." "I agree with all my heart," cried the Beauty and the Beast Queen. "Now," said the fairy to Beauty, "I suppose you would like me to send for your father and sisters?" She did so. The marriage was celebrated the very next day, and Beauty and the prince lived happily ever after. There were once a man and a woman who had long wished for a child, but without any luck. At last, the woman hoped that God was about to grant her desire. They had a little window at the back of their house from which a splendid garden could be seen, which was full of the most beautiful flowers and herbs. It was, however, surrounded by a high wall, and no one dared to go into it because it belonged to an enchantress, who had great power and was dreaded by all the world. One day the woman was standing by this window and looking down into the garden, when she saw a bed which was planted with the most beautiful plant called a Rapunzel, and it looked so fresh and green that she longed for it. She quite pined away, and began to look pale and miserable. Then her husband was alarmed, and asked, "What troubles you, dear wife?" "Ah," she replied, "if I can't eat some of the Rapunzel, which is in the garden behind our house, I shall die." The man, who loved her, thought, "Sooner than let your wife die, better bring her some of the Rapunzel, let it cost you what it will." When it was getting dark, he clambered down over the wall into the garden of the enchantress, hastily clutched a handful of the Rapunzel plant and took it to his wife. She at once made herself a salad of it, and ate it greedily. It tasted so good to her, so very good that the next day she longed for it 3 times as much as before. If he was to have any rest, her husband must once more descend into the garden. In the gloom of evening therefore, he let himself down again, but when he had clambered down the wall he was struck with terror, for he saw the enchantress standing before him. "How can you dare," said she with angry look, "climb down into my garden and steal my Rapunzel, like a thief? You shall suffer for it." "Ah," answered he, "let mercy take the place of justice, I only made up my mind to do it out of necessity. My wife saw your Rapunzel from the window, and felt such a longing for it that she would have died if she had not gotten some to eat." Then the enchantress allowed her anger to be softened, and said to him, "If you speak the truth, I will allow you to take away with you as much Rapunzel as you will, only I make one condition: you must give me the child which your wife will bring into the world. It shall be well treated, and I will care for it like a mother." The man in his terror agreed to everything, and when the child was born, the enchantress appeared at once, gave the child the name of Rapunzel, and took it away with her. Rapunzel grew into the most beautiful child under the sun. When she was 12 years old, the enchantress shut her in a tower, which lay in a forest, and had neither stairs nor door, but quite at the top was a little window. When the enchantress wanted to go in, she placed herself beneath it and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair to me." Rapunzel had magnificent long hair, fine as spun gold, and when she heard the voice of the enchantress she unfastened her braided tresses, wound them around one of the hooks of the window above. Then the hair fell 20 yards down, and the enchantress climbed up by it. After a year or 2, it happened that the king's son rode through the forest and passed by the tower. Then he heard a song, which was so charming that he stood still and listened. This was Rapunzel, who in her solitude passed her time in letting her sweet voice sing out. The king's son wanted to climb up to her, and looked for the door of the tower, but none was to be found. He rode home, but the singing had so deeply touched his heart that every day he went out into the forest and listened to it. Once when he was thus standing behind a tree, he saw that an enchantress came there, and he heard how she cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair to me." Rapunzel let down the braids of her hair, and the enchantress climbed up to her. "If that is the ladder that leads to the top, I too will try my fortune," said he, and the next day when it began to grow dark, he went to the tower and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair to me." Immediately the hair fell down and the prince climbed up. At first Rapunzel was terribly frightened when a man, such as her eyes had never yet beheld, came to her, but the king's son began to talk to her quite like a friend, and told her that his heart had been so stirred that it had let him have no rest, he had been forced to see her. Rapunzel lost her fear, and when he asked her if she would take him for her husband, and she saw that he was young and handsome, she thought, "He will love me more than old Dame Gothel the enchantress does," so she said yes, and laid her hand in his. She said, "I will willingly go away with you, but I do not know how to get down. Bring with you a ball of silk every time that you come, and I will weave a ladder with it. When that is ready I will climb down, and you will take me on your horse." They agreed that until that time he should come to her every evening, for the old woman came by day. The enchantress remarked nothing of this, until once Rapunzel said to her, "Tell me, Dame Gothel, how it happens that you are so much heavier for me to draw up than the young king's son. He is with me in a moment." "Ah! You wicked child," cried the enchantress. "What do I hear you say? I thought I had separated you from all the world, and yet you have deceived me." In her anger she clutched Rapunzel's beautiful hair, wrapped it twice around her left hand, seized a pair of scissors with the right, and snip-snap, they were cut off, and the lovely braids lay on the ground. She was so pitiless that she took poor Rapunzel into a desert where she had to live in great grief and misery. On the same day that she cast out Rapunzel, however, the enchantress fastened the braids of hair, which she had cut off, to the hook of the window, and when the king's son came and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair to me," she let the hair down and the king's son climbed, but instead of finding his dearest Rapunzel, he found the enchantress, who gazed at him with wicked and poisonous looks. "Aha!" she cried mockingly. "You would fetch your dearest, but the beautiful bird sits no longer singing in the nest, the cat has got it, and will scratch out your eyes as well. Rapunzel is lost to you, you will never see her again." The king's son was beside himself with pain, and in his despair he leaped down from the tower. He escaped with his life, but the thorns into which he fell pierced his eyes. Then he wandered quite blindly about the forest, ate nothing but roots and berries, and did naught but weep over the loss of his dearest wife. Thus he roamed about in misery for some years, and at last came to the desert where Rapunzel, with the twins to which she had given birth, a boy and a girl, lived in wretchedness. He heard a voice, and it seemed so familiar to him that he went towards it, and when he approached, Rapunzel knew him and fell on his neck and wept. 2 of her tears wetted his eyes and they grew clear again, and he could see with them as before. He led her to his kingdom where he was joyfully received, and they lived for a long time afterwards, happy and contented.